Donald Rumsfeld overruled them, said no, that this is not ending anytime soon. We're going to Baghdad. Bolton and Wormser's job was preventing Powell and Armitage, his guy, from preventing the war. This was a real hard motivating factor for the neoconservatives to want to launch this war.
Scott Horton recently went on Lex Friedman's podcast to expose the truth about Iraq war propaganda, the lies sold to the American people by the Bush administration in the weeks and years after 9/11 to justify one of the worst misadventures in U.S. foreign policy history, and just get a load of Scott explaining how Israel and an asset of Iran figure into this thing. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
The region in your head a little bit, or pull up the map again if you need to. Here's David Wormser's argument, okay? He's saying Iran backs Hezbollah in southern Lebanon by way of Syria. So what we want to do is get rid of Saddam Hussein, the secular Sunni, who's the roadblock to all this, right? Huh? Well, again, magic wish. What's going to happen is our Sunni king will just enslave the will of the Shiite supermajority, and they'll be our cat's paws and do whatever we want, and we'll lord them over Iran. David Wormser said, Chalabi assures us that a democratic Shiite Iraq will be a nightmare for Iran, because the Iranians will want to live like the Iraqis in their wonderful, new, awesome supermajority Shiite democracy. And so under the rule of their benevolent king, or however, because they end up changing it a little bit, I guess, and emphasizing the democracy part more later. But still, it would be a nightmare for Iran, because what happened was, I think the king of Jordan died and was replaced. And they said, okay, forget that. We'll just put Chalabi in power himself. He'll be the guy that we put in. Now, they also Chalabi promised the neoconservatives, we'll build an oil pipeline from northern Iraq to Haifa, Israel, to make up for the pipeline that they just lost with the Iranians. Netanyahu bought this, and David Wormser and Richard Pearl bought this.
And just think about that. They were alleging that overthrowing Saddam would have positive reverberations throughout the region. That's what Netanyahu argued himself in front of Congress in 2002, talking about this. But also, they absurdly argued that this would be a bulwark against the Iranian regime, that, Iranians might rise up and overthrow their government because Iraq then had a secular democracy instead of secular rule by a secular Sunni that was Saddam. But instead of that, what actually was the truth was Chalabi, this guy on the ground in Iraq, presumably an Iraqi dissident, was actually an Iranian agent. That came out afterward, but they took his advice hook, line, and sinker, and what transpired was in accordance with Chalabi's desires as an Iranian asset, as Iranian influence poured into Iraq in the years later in the U.S. occupation. That's why Saudi Arabia even opposed this war. They saw what it was going to turn into was a power vacuum in which the Iranians installed influence in Iraq that we're seeing to this day.
And this is one of the major reasons that 4,500 Americans and 1 million Iraqis died in Iraq War II, was so Israel could save a nickel a barrel on Iraqi oil, because their own policies had cost them their access to Iranian oil. And so they were paying this extra premium after losing that source. And this oil pipeline to Haifa was a big deal. So in other words, Richard Pearl is as stupid as he is evil. And David Wormser and Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and the neoconservative group, Douglas Feith, Scooter Libby, Hadley and Joseph and Edelman and all of these guys who rode, did I say Hannah and Edelman and Abrams, Shulsky. That's what these idiots believed.
These are all neocons?
These are the neocons in the W. Bush administration.
Yeah, this is all true. And if you read back the Clean Break memo, it was a 96 memo authored by Richard Pearl and David Wormser, two of the most prominent neocons of this time. They argued that Israel needed to break from this idea of making peace with their Arabian neighbors, supporting a Palestinian state. That's what the clean break was, that Israel would now go to war with those regimes. Iraq was one of the first of those that was supported by the neocons as well, and not support a two-state solution in Palestine, in Israel, for the Palestinians. And that's what we get from these stupid entangling alliances, with them arguing that this guy Chalabi is the one to be trusted, getting Netanyahu to buy this nonsense, testifying as a regional expert in front of Congress, this load of crap about weapons of mass destruction, when it really was about trying to destabilize Iran and help Israel with this oil pipeline to save them a few cents a barrel, when 1 million Iraqis eventually died in this. And that's what, people just overlook. We wouldn't, know their names. They never printed their names, but 1 million people died over this, and hundreds of thousands of people died before this because of the U.S. embargo and enforcement of the no-fly zone. This was the Iraq War. This was what the neocons sold us.
In the vice president's office, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, that lied us into war. Colin Powell called them the JINSA crowd. JINSA is the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, which at that time I believe was run by David Wurmser. He was one of the most powerful guys there. And they were part and parcel with the American Enterprise Institute, the Project for a New American Century, the Center for Security Policy, and the other of the major neoconservative think tanks that pushed for that war at that time.
Yeah, and JINSA still exists, by the way. I don't know if Wurmser still has involvement, but the organizations he just named are a big core of the still surviving Israel lobby. I mean, AIPAC was part of this too, but the Israeli government wanted this war, this regime change operation in Iraq, just as much as the most zealous neocons did, like Richard Perle and Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and David Wurmser and all these people he's talking about.
And they had power. That influence?
They had all the power and influence they needed because they got it from Dick Cheney and George W. Bush. And what Powell said was this was a separate government inside the government that was run like a cell that was run by Dick Cheney. Wurmser was known as Cheney's agent, his plant at State, where his job, he and John Bolton, who is not a neoconservative because he's never any kind of leftist, he's just a conservative nationalist type. But
well, his foreign policy is indistinguishable from the neocons, but Scott's right, technically. Most of the early neocons were former Trotskyites, believing that you could export not the proletariat revolution, but in this context, exporting democracy overseas through these revolutions. That's what the early neocons like Irving Kristol and William F. Buckley believed.
One of their fellow travelers, very close with them. Bolton and Wurmser's job was preventing Powell and Armitage, his guy, from preventing the war, to keep a leash on them in whatever ways that they could obstruct their efforts. Then Newt Gingrich was another fellow traveler, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Republican, who you could consider him sort of like John Bolton in a way, where he's like more or less one of them, but not exactly. But for example, you may have heard the stories about how Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby made 14 trips to CIA headquarters to beat them over the head and say, we need more against Iraq. Come up with it. And they wouldn't come up with it enough. Well, Newt Gingrich did the same thing, went to CIA headquarters over and over and over again, saying, give us the goods. We don't have enough. We need more.
And that's really dark.
Yeah. So then under Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense was Douglas Feith, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, and under him was Abram Shulsky. And Shulsky was the guy who ran the Office of Special Plans, which sounds innocuous enough, but this was the core of the neoconservative plot to launder lies from Ahmed Chalabi's exile group, the Iraqi National Congress, into the intelligence stream, along with whatever they could dig out of the CIA's trash that the CIA had decided already to ignore.
Yeah, and this precedent is long-lasting. We see it rear its ugly head up even just weeks ago when the U.S. got into a war with Iran, because what happened there? You know, this idea of trying to manipulate the intelligence in a way to support a propaganda scheme to launch a war, that's not something that just ended there in 2003. That's something that we just saw this year when, a lot of congressional members sat and saw Tulsi Gabbard's annual threat assessment saying not only is there no evidence that Iran has started their nuclear program since dismantling it, but they're not even trying to build a nuclear bomb. Well, that she was basically attacked by prominent neocons, members of the military-industrial complex, the supporters of that lobby, telling her, "Well, just change the intelligence." Because that's what happens in Washington, and eventually that's what happened. The day before the U.S. struck Iran, she suddenly said Iran's weeks away from acquiring a nuclear weapon, when even Netanyahu wasn't willing to go that far a few days before that in his interview. This happens time and time again, but that's exactly what they did in the run-up to this exact war. When the intelligence doesn't match our agenda, well, should we change our agenda? No, just change the intelligence. That's what the U.S. does. That's what the Uniparty does. That's what the neocons did. And the neocon influence in our government is still tangible. It's still palpable in today's foreign policy.
And they had Michael Rubin and Michael Ledeen and a whole group of, I used to know all of their names, the guys with the Office of Special Plans. There's 6 or 8 of them. And across the hall was the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, which was led by David Wormser. Again, he's traveling around. He's vice president's office, he's state, he's defense, wherever they need him. And that's Wormser and a guy named Michael Maloof. And their job was to dig through the CIA's trash and the exiles' lies and try to come up with anything to connect Saddam to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And these guys all had this agenda. And man, it was Zionism is at the core of it all. And there's really just no denying that. And in many cases, they admitted it. And there are very authoritative sources on this. For example, Thomas L. Friedman of the New York Times was for a very long time a reporter and is now, of course, the famous columnist, wrote The Lexus and the Olive Tree and The World is Flat. Bill Clinton said he's the most important public intellectual in America. Is a somewhat conservative Jewish Zionist, New York Times writer, and Iraq War supporter. Okay. But he gave an interview. He is not a neoconservative and not really a fellow traveler of theirs. He's a guy who just lives in the same world as them, but he knows a hell of a lot. He's extremely plugged in. Okay. For people who don't know, look him up. Okay. Thomas L. Friedman. Thomas L. Friedman gave an interview to Haaretz where he goes, "Let me tell you something. Okay. There's 9 guys within a mile of here, and they're the ones who did it." I'm sorry, I'm getting the quote wrong. I think the 9 guys was Seymour Hersh said it was 9 guys. But Friedman said something very close to that to Haaretz, that it was the neoconservatives. It was this very small group of guys. This was their war. They plotted it. They planned it. They made the advertising push to make it acceptable. It was their war, and they got it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it was indeed Seymour Hersh who said that. He wrote a book in 2004 about this and about the circumstances Scott is talking about. As Scott talks about how there was essentially a government within a government pushing for this, that is kind of palpable and provable. That is in accordance with the documented evidence. And that just, again, it's reminiscent of what even Schlesinger said to Kennedy back in the 60s, shortly before Kennedy was killed. He said, in warning about this, and the file was finally released and unredacted more recently under the Trump administration, he said, there's essentially a government within the government. That's the CIA. It's operating a rogue foreign policy regardless of the electoral desires of the American people. Because when Bush was elected, he was elected on a humble foreign policy against nation building. He even talked about that during the campaign. But what does he do? Once he gets in there, these neocons push him over the edge, not to say he wasn't inclined to do it and has culpability for it. He certainly does. But he let the Paul Wolfowitzes and Dick Cheneys and David Wormsers and Richard Pearls of the world steer U.S. foreign policy for the worse because of it. It's a shadow government, just as Schlesinger warned about and prophesied.
That's what it was. Philip Zelikow, who was not a neoconservative, he was more of a Council on Foreign Relations type with Condoleezza Rice and Robert Blackwell and some of those other guys who were not part of the neoconservative set in the same government. Zelikow, you might remember, was the principal author of the 9/11 Commission report. A lot of people don't like him for that, for whatever reasons, good and bad probably. But Zelikow said, let me tell you something, okay, about the motivation for the Iraq War. And this is not something that you'll hear very much, okay? But Saddam Hussein paid the families of Palestinian suicide bombers. Saddam Hussein would pay any family who lost anybody into Israeli violence, no matter what, no matter what. So that meant if the Israelis bulldozed some old lady in her home and murdered her, then Saddam Hussein would pay a bounty to her survivors. But it also meant if some guy went and did a suicide attack and blew up a pizzeria full of kids on a Friday night, Saddam Hussein would pay a bounty to his survivors too. So this was quite clearly incentivizing terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians, right? So that is a real security problem for Israel.
Yeah, and this is in addition to, the propaganda and the idea that an oil pipeline would be built from northern Iraq to Haifa, Israel. It's in accordance with their belief that it would destabilize the Iranian regime. So there were many reasons that Israel supported the overthrow of Saddam too. Now, again, this isn't to take any of the blame away from the neocons in the U.S., for launching this war. I'm an equal opportunity blamer, blaster, whatever you want to call it. But Scott's exactly right. This is what the documented proof shows us.
And as Philip Zelikow said, this was a real hard motivating factor for the neoconservatives to want to launch this war. You can't read the guy's mind. There's so much circumstantial evidence about the thinking at the time. And this was going to what I was saying about CIA and Rice said we should just bomb Al-Qaeda and not the Taliban. Donald Rumsfeld overruled them, said, no, we need to take the fight to the Taliban. We need to keep the Afghan war going on because we want the American people to understand. He actually proposed that we should bomb Baghdad now so that the American people understand the war on terrorism is not over if we kill bin Laden, and it ain't lost if we don't. The war is much bigger than him, and it is going to take place over a vast space and a vast period of time. And we want the American people to know that this is not ending anytime soon. We're going to Baghdad. It's going to take a while to build up the force in Kuwait, and they hoped Turkey, which didn't work out, but in order to go. And so if we kill bin Laden now, or even if we do, we want to make sure the American people know that the war's not over yet.
Yeah, that's the thing about wars against abstract ideas, like the war on terrorism. And in a way, it's kind of related to the war on drugs and the war on poverty, things like that. When there's a war against an abstraction, there's really no endpoint because you can't eliminate human nature. And terrorism has been going on forever. And if you ask me, the greatest purveyor of terrorism in the world is the United States. It's my criminal government. That doesn't make me anti-American to say. I think that makes me a patriot to tell the truth about things that are controversial when it's most controversial, actually. That's what Ron Paul did best. That's what Harry Brown did best. Dennis Kucinich and other dissidents who blasted U.S. foreign policy when it was most controversial to them. So Scott's right. What they did was they took the earnest patriotic outpourings of Americans and twisted it to nefarious ends. Not only by removing the Taliban, replacing it after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives with the Taliban, having a 20-year occupation in Iraq, and quickly pivoting from Afghanistan to Iraq. Toward the end of 2001, the drumbeat for propaganda was already starting. Into 2002, they said they hated us for our freedom. No, they hated us for our foreign policy. At least our criminal government's foreign policy, not only for misdeeds in Iraq, the starvation campaign there, the endless support for Israel no matter what. I think Israel had received something like $250 billion in U.S. money even at that time for siding with Israel on everything, for populating the Arabian Peninsula, which Muslims consider holy, with U.S. military forces, using it as a staging ground for the Gulf War, before, during, and after the Gulf War, with bases remaining there still to this day. Those were the reasons, and that's not to excuse any of the terrorism. And I wouldn't excuse any terrorism, regardless of country, on that basis. But it is worth noting, it is worth remembering, such that we avert those things in the future. But thanks, Scott, for this. Let me know down below, is Scott right about the Iraq War, the propaganda we received, and why the U.S. turned against Saddam Hussein after supporting him in the Iraq-Iran war? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Lex too. Thanks for having Scott. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel. And in return, I'll give you access access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on my channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.